Our next speaker, J Sai Deepak, is an engineer turned litigator practicing as an arguing counsel before the Supreme Court of India and the High Court of Delhi. A mechanical engineer from Annamalai University, Sai graduated with a bachelor's degree in law from IIT Kharagpur's Law School in 2009 and has carved a niche for himself as a litigator in civil, commercial, and constitutional matters. He has been part of several landmark cases, such as those related to the Sabarimala Ayyappa Temple, the Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple, the Basmati geographical indications, and the marital rape exception in the Indian Penal Code. In 2019, Sai was awarded the Young Alumni Achievers Award by his alma mater, IIT Kharagpur. Apart from delivering lectures on constitutional issues, he writes prolifically for leading newspapers and magazines. He is the author of the best-selling book of the Bharat trilogy, India That is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution. We will now have J Sai Deepak in conversation with Anand Ranganathan on what does the future portend for Bharat, an attempt at crystal gazing.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So this is a real joy for as much as for you as it is for me to have Sai amidst us. And I think there's... And I always quip that if forget about lawyers, for anything you want to say, you should hear what Sai's views are, and only after you know what his views are, then maybe kind of structure or restructure what your views are going to be on that. So it's a real joy to have Sai amongst us, and it's really remarkable, what he's done in such a short span of time. Here we have only 35 minutes to us, and of course the soul sisters, the two soul, there they are. They're laughing right now, but their nails are out like this. So, and they have the bell somewhere, I think. So we would be very careful, but we thought you would like to ask Sai a lot of questions. So more than half of this 35 minutes we've kept for question and answer session. And the other half, I thought I'll begin by, in a couple of minutes, to summarize what I think of this, and then I leave it to Sai, and then we can ask each other a couple of questions, then we'll throw open. So, it's a very interesting topic. What does the future portend for Bharat? So not India, but Bharat. An attempt at crystal gazing. So in one aspect, I think it's, I'll possibly talk of a glass half full, half empty, and Sai would possibly, I don't know, knowing him, he will talk of both, I suppose, glass half full and half empty. But if one were to, in one way, it's quite easy, this attempt at crystal gazing. I know there's no crystal ball here, but at least I can, kick off by saying from 24 to 26 would be Narendra Modi. From 26 to 29 is Amit Shah. From 29 to 34 is Yogi. From 34 to 39 is Yogi again. छोड़ना नहीं है. तब तक ये सारे historians और क्या हैं डाई सब इनका, but all through that Rahul Gandhi would be the leader of the opposition. So that is. Then from 39 to 44. 39 to 44 would be Hemanta Biswa. 44 to 46 would be Annamalai. And 46 to 49 would be J Sai Deepak. Tejasvi. But you would have a fight with Tejasvi. He would form another party, and he would give you outside support. That's like Dr. Swami is doing. No, but so in one sense, that is what crystal gazing is. I think the whole psychology of the nation has changed. I would say towards the better. And we were talking the other day in Pune about, this scare that people generate about Hindu Rashtra is coming. And I put it on that table that Hindu Rashtra is already here. And, our constitution is much more stringent against Hindus than Hindu Rashtra would ever be. So, right now, Hindus are suffering the constitution, which possibly they wouldn't when Hindu Rashtra would be there. And if it is there already, then what are we got to worry about? And Sai knows we were talking about the control of Hindu temples and so on and so forth. But coming back to that, away from crystal gazing, what does the future portend for Bharat? And there, I don't want to go, there's a lot of cackle, there's a lot of static. If I can borrow your mic. Thank you. Yeah. So I don't need to go further down 30, 40 years till the Prime Minister of India is sitting next to me. But 5 to 10 years, and I think it is, as I say, to me, it looks like, and we're talking of Bharat, not India. So we're talking of, making amenities available to 1 billion people, if I can put it that way. So this is not aspirational. This is something that Rozmarra ki zindagi, or, in your daily life, what you require, what all of us take for granted, don't even think about. Those things, tapped water, electricity, gas cylinder, toilets, those would be supplied, housing. Now, that pace has certainly quickened tremendously under Modi. There is no doubt about it. It is also a fact that all those things, although less innovative, especially in Ujjwala or insurance scheme, health insurance, were being done by previous governments as well, Congress and non-Congress governments as well, including Atal Bihari Vajpayee. The question is not that we should be a welfare state. I, for one, I like India to be a welfare state till such time that we don't have to worry about supplying all these common things to necessities to people. Till that time, India should be a welfare state. But the thing that we don't realize is that welfare state is only possible in a capitalist state. Welfare state is not possible in a socialist state because very quickly you'll run out of money. You need to generate money to then spend it, and you decide to spend it on welfare. Now, why do I say that? Many people amongst you would say, "Arey, ye to JNU se, ye to kahega ye welfare state." But the fact of the matter is that every capitalist organization or corporate is now doing what they call as CSR, corporate social responsibility. They're giving back to the society. They want their workforce to be happy and healthy. Well, India has a labor force of 515 million people. And Shamika yesterday talked about how 50% of them are not actually taking part in what they should be. And that's not good for any economy. You need a fitter, highly educated, or even educated, healthy, not debilitated with disease, a workforce that will contribute to the economy. And that is right now possible only with a welfare state. So yes, India needs to be a welfare state. The only question is, how do you keep on generating money to pay for these toilets, to pay for Ujjwala, to pay for Ayushman Bharat, to pay for tapped water? You need that money. And I'm sorry, we just have not been able to get away from this disease of socialism, of state control, of realizing that paise, you cannot generate, as Margaret Thatcher used to say, that socialism is only good till such time you run out of other people's money. So we are using other people's money, and that cannot be good for a state. So in very short, before I pass on the mic to Sai, the future does not portend very well for Bharat, because very soon they would have housing, they would already have bank accounts, they already have toilets, they are going to have tap water, every one of them is going to be insured, and after that, what? They are going to ask for more. Bharat is soon going to become, and I'm not lauding India here, just to say that there is something above Bharat. You can say Bharat 2.0 if you don't want to use the word India. But Bharat 1.0 needs to go to not the second part of J Sai's trilogy, of Bharat trilogy, but Bharat 2.0. And there people, the same people who are right now satisfied कि हमें तो toilet मिल गया, हमें तो आयुष्मान भारत हो गया, हमारे बच्चे स्कूल जा रहे हैं, they are going to say, after that what? We need something else. So are we planning for that? For Bharat, I dare say we cannot, unless somebody tells me that your next bolus of 30 lakh crores is going to come from here. Your next 40 lakh crores is going to come from. Nobody is thinking in tens of lakhs of crores. We are just thinking in 1,000 crores, 2,000 crores that we've gained this FDI, we lose that thing. It's incremental. We need to decide these reforms, agricultural reforms, which I won't go into, but things like that, that are so momentous, they will change the course of the country. Those things are not happening. I don't think our politicians right now have the strength to go for that. When those things happen, then Bharat will transform to Bharat 2.0. But till now, I don't see a very good future for Bharat. Sai.
Thank you. Namaste. Thank you for turning up in such huge numbers for the post-lunch session. We'll try and keep this as informative and as possible. If I have to identify the areas of concern, I would say 2004 effectively marked the arrival of the non-left political veto, rather 2014. Then over the last few years, we've seen a very clear academic resistance being put up. Whether or not we are the mainstream, that is for perhaps posterity to decide, but I would say that at this point, we cannot be ignored, thanks to the likes of Anand, Vikram, and so many others. The question that perhaps we are now looking at, in light of what has happened over the last 18 months or so, is are we going to be pushed to develop a street veto? So the political veto has arrived, the academic veto is here. Will we need a street veto? Which is perhaps the most uncomfortable and icky question to answer. If yes, how do you do justice to your allegiance to the Constitution and still put together a semblance of resistance to prevent a worse eventuality? Or are we going to be forced to hug the cactus? That's a question that perhaps we may have to ask in the next decade. Now, apart from this, I think you may have to do justice to 2 or 3 things, and to build on what Anand has just said, is how do you deal with belligerent neighbors? How do you satisfy the aspirations, the economic aspirations of a society? Because once you've kickstarted an aspirational model, there is perhaps no end to this. Therefore, what's going to be your economic model? Is this going to be endless growth? And to ask this question, would it put me in the same basket as a Luddite? Hopefully not. How do you do justice to those aspirations, bearing in mind that climate change is a reality, coupled with the fact that you're not exactly a resource plus society or a resource plus, let's say, landscape, so to speak? How do you do justice to all of this? I think these would be our challenges. Last evening, Mr. Vembu made a wonderful point, which is that it's not going to be possible to pursue the Western economic model, at least as far as this part of the world is concerned, without doing grave injustice to environmental concerns, and also the sheer population that you may have to feed and do all that. But his point was, the solution is not to ask them to be happy where they are. That's not the definition of contentment that he came out with. In fact, his position was you may have to do some kind of trade-off between prosperity and contentment. And that would mean Bharat is not going to indulge in an academic discussion on what could be a different model of growth or economics. It may have to be a real-time discussion, because you may not have the ability to pursue economics or, let's say, growth the same way that the West has, considering that the timelines are different, considering that our realities are different. But if you do not have the economic wherewithal, would you be in a position to put up a resistance to China is an important question. So I think these are not easy questions to answer. I don't claim to have the answers. I'm just trying to highlight the issues that we may have to cross and deal with over the next decade or so at the very least. I look at 2030 perhaps as a tipping point, if not 2024. And 2030 could perhaps require this civilization to take a very serious decision with respect to the way forward. Because going by the let's say, the extraneous additions to the population, and I'm sure the audience understands what I'm pointing at, we may have to deal with a lot of issues which we are trying to ignore. Because you see, at one point, this is a very interesting phase we are in, because you're looking at an explosion of voices on the cultural front, on the academic front, while simultaneously you're being beheaded one by one. So the definition of terror has changed, the execution has changed, the modus operandi has changed. So you cannot anymore look at, let's say, your scorecard on the terror front from the perspective of how many bomb blasts did you manage to prevent, how many terrorist attacks you managed to prevent, because everything that's going on at this point, by definition of the law, is a terror attack. There is no other way of putting it. Are we in a position to deal with it? In which case, are we going to create a paranoid society? Because if your neighbor is going to be the next person who's going to lynch you or kill you, then what kind of a society are you looking at? So before economics, perhaps protection and survival may be the first issues that we may have to confront and deal with before we look at the next issue. Economics तो बाद में आएगा, पहले जिंदा तो रहें, उसके बाद देखते हैं क्या होता है. So the flashpoints obviously would be Kerala, Bengal, Western Uttar Pradesh. Kashmir, according to me, is still not a resolved issue. It's not a settled fact. To put it in the language of the Britishman who used the word settled fact after the partition of Bengal in 1905. According to me, 370 doesn't lead to Kashmir being a settled fact. Perhaps the game has just about started. Will this lead to resettlement of Kashmiri Hindus? We still don't know. And if the events of the last year are anything to go by, the situation is still bleak and grim. Perhaps the Indian state has a greater hold over the situation there and has managed to gain some kind of leverage over the cottage industry, the conflict cottage industry. But does it translate to creating conducive atmospherics for resettlement of Hindus? I think is still a huge question mark. We still don't know. And the oft-neglected aspect of Bharat's geography, the Northeast, what's going to happen there is something that we need to seriously consider, because that has become perhaps a crown colony of sorts, if not in the manner in which the British intended it, but for different reasons it has become a crown colony. Will Bharat be able to assert itself on the global stage without being able to address multiple parallel governance structures in all these flashpoints? Would you have the moral authority, or let's say even the respect of the rest of the world, if you cannot dismantle all these parallel governance structures, which for all practical purposes, some parts of the country actually charge a tax as well. So if there exists a government which is charging a tax alongside you, then आपके घर के मतलब ऊपर इतने बड़े प्रश्न चिन्ह हैं, you can't even handle the neighborhood after that. So one of the things that I've been very, very careful about, at least after the first term of 2014 to 2019, is maybe before we start projecting our aspirations of the status of Vishwaguru, let's first set our house in order. And in that sense, I would certainly give credit to the fact that we are trying to get our basics right in the first place on the economic front. One of the reasons why I don't see culture and economics in silos is several cultural issues are capable of being addressed if the economic aspects are addressed, which means, to be honest and to be blunt, if you take away the incentive for conversion to a significant extent by having a prosperous society, to some extent you can even prevent the stem of conversions to a significant extent. So I'm looking at it from that perspective. And this is not the esoteric thinking of the well-fed. We have all come up the hard way. At least my generation, most of us have come up the hard way. So we understand the importance of economics, and we also understand that there is no need to trade off culture or civilization on the anvils of economics. Both can go hand in hand, and Bharat has no other option but to ensure that both go hand in hand, because we perhaps represent a certain civilizational resistance. So that, I think, would be more or less the, let's say, the picture of the future in terms of the issues that we will deal with. The outcomes are, of course, in the hands of the gods and plural. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sai. If I can, before we throw open, I can ask you a question. It was quite clear to me that the issues that I was talking about, and both of us talked only about Bharat, the issues that I talked about that Bharat needs right now, and if you were to correlate it to why Modi won the second term, I would put to you that Bharat, more often, more largely than any other constituency, if you want to call it that, was satisfied. Bharat was satisfied because what Bharat got was exactly what Modi promised Bharat would get. Gas cylinders at breakneck speed. Gadkari was there to provide highways. Then you had, Ayushman Bharat, health insurance. You had so many other things. Basically, the necessities Modi promised and Modi delivered. So Bharat, I put to you, did not have much of a grouse. And I also added to that 15 years down the line, Bharat will start having grouse because all that money has to come from something. So right now, all that money is coming from borrowing. Very little of it's being generated to, or maybe a fraction of what India is capable of generating. We are still shackled into a socialist state, proud socialist state. I mean, I don't want to even go into the details of the examples. We're still growing sugarcane to the extent we are the world's second largest producer of sugarcane. We are destroying the environment through that. We use the irrigation water required for that is equivalent to 1 quadrillion liters. It requires only 7% of arable land, but it requires 77% of irrigation water. And sugar prices have halved in the last 6 years. And just day before yesterday, the government increased purchase of sugarcane to 350 rupees per quintal. So, we are a socialist state. 10, 15 years down the line, Bharat would start to wonder, look, it is not going according to how we planned. We were satisfied, we are not satisfied now. What you seem to be saying, that Bharat has not demarcated necessity and economic prosperity and what it is getting with the cultural one. So you're saying something very interesting, that maybe Bharat wants both of them to go side by side, and what you also said, Bharat would prefer to have protection before economic prosperity. Did I hear you right in that?
So I don't think we have arrived at a point where perhaps, notwithstanding the fact that development is a necessity, and that can't be denied at all, I don't think it has become an issue on the basis of which elections can still be contested. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I would simply judge it on the anvils of whether Hindus can afford to treat development as the primary parameter on the basis of which you decide on the performance of a particular government. I don't think we have arrived, we don't have the luxury of taking that decision yet. In your opening remark, you made a point on the state being a welfare state and whether is it desirable in the first place. I would want to think of a model, and with people like Muthuramanji being here and other economists being here who are capable of answering this question, I would seriously ask myself this question: is there a way that the society is a welfare society whereas the state is not a welfare state? And strike the distinction between the state and the society. Is there a way that societal institutions can partner with the state to ensure that certain benefits are rendered on the basis of community resources, the manner in which German churches aid the government of Germany? Is that a model that you can consider looking at? In which case, then, of course, it will come back to the pet peeve of who controls those institutions, who has the say with respect to its resources, what would be the identity of the state, so on and so forth. That model may actually work well without, and I would hope that these obligations, societal obligations which are cast on the societal institutions, come from within as opposed to a state imposition. Okay? That way, you would have perhaps done something which is very, very important, moved the needle from a rights-based discourse to a duty-based discourse to a significant extent by creating such an atmosphere. And the burden and the tendency to look up to the state for everything, that my bap mentality, could come down. And you're hoping to create a certain spirit of self-reliance in the society itself by making sure that these institutions take responsibility for some of these aspects. Now, for instance, whenever there is, let's say, disaster management that has to be undertaken, there is no active handshake between the state and the society when it comes to disaster management. Everybody does it because they feel that they have to or they want to, but there is no plan here which involves making them stakeholders or participants in such, let's say, situations. Going beyond disaster management, can we look at the next level as well? Start with disaster management and see how you can partner with them, and then extension of civil facilities, identification of groups, inclusion of these institutions for the purposes of census collection. That is a role that several of these institutions perform in Europe. If that seems to be the model that you constantly look up to, these are the things that you could perhaps learn from them as opposed to the worst of things possible.
So that's a very interesting thing that makes me also reconsider to some extent my stand, although I have to think about it. What you're saying is that going forward, the welfareism aspect of India, which is required, can be shared. It need not be put, the onus need not be put entirely on the shoulders of the government. But for that, I put to you, Sai, that the government itself is stifling the sharing of this welfareism, because to take one example of the control of Hindu temples, I mean, you have 113,000 temples under government control. And Sai knows more about this, and T.R. Ramesh, our friend, than anyone else. The fact of the matter is that with those thousands and thousands of acres of temple land that are under the control of government, the rent the government gets is in lakhs. The rent the temples would get, if it was their land, would be in lakhs of crores. So the loss itself is phenomenal, and that money that the temples would earn would then go to welfareism, would go into setting up of Hindu schools or other schools or hospitals, which churches and other organizations of other religious communities are doing at breakneck speed. Hindus are being shackled, they're not allowed to do that. On top of that, any money that is earned by the Hindu temple, the government charges state to state, that varies administration fee. So in Andhra it is 21%, in Tamil Nadu it is 12%. So you are milking the amount that the Hindus have that they could use for welfare state. Did I read you correct, sir? Yeah. But do you see a change happening there?
So, I think what I'm trying to do perhaps is to reach out to the economic right of the country to perhaps make a case for temple freedom in a slightly different way, assuming that the civilizational pitch has failed miserably. Let's assume that's the case. Then what is the way forward? That's one. So if you look at most of these HRC legislations, you have something called as a provision for CGF, the Common Good Fund. Okay. And the Common Good Fund effectively envisages the use of surplus funds that come from the temple
Terribly
collection.
sorry to interrupt you. On this Common Good Fund, at least of Tirupati I know, they recently built a flyover costing 600 crores. The government put in 150 crores and they took 450 crores from the temple.
So there I will apply my, call me a bigger periculus, doesn't matter, but I would say I would want the use of those funds exclusively for the community to which the money belongs. That's the first thing. The second thing is there is a serious mental barrier among Hindus, even when this point is made to their own benefit, which is that they say, all of us benefit, so what's the problem? That's the stupidest answer that you could actually get, because you don't realize what's happening. But that every such instance is a gradual encroachment of your autonomy over your own resources, and with that your space and so on and so forth. So I'm saying, okay, let's try and recast that sentiment and try and project it into a different direction altogether. You have a certain bleeding heart altruistic tendency, okay, let's at least change the target audience to which this is done, as opposed to cutting off that particular issue altogether. I'm saying limit it to a particular audience. And that way you benefit directly. So that caters to our wonderful sense of self-interest and self-preservation, and also make sure that your attempt at being a bleeding heart is also catered to some extent, right? So that way you could do this, and you can try and see if you can address issues such as education, health services, and perhaps, let's say, nobody goes hungry policy, as far as we are concerned. If, let's say, the Common Good Fund can be used on these lines, with the community being made responsible for the execution of these plans, and the resources coming back to the community's hands, I would assume that perhaps certain basic issues which the government is trying to spend its money on could be saved by the government, and that could be put to good use to some other, let's say, initiative, and the community taking responsibility for this. There are certain solutions which are possible, which is why if most people have bothered to notice, or if they bother to read the petitions, it's not as if the entire dhancha or the framework of the TNHRC legislation or any HRC legislation is sought to be struck down fully. Got it? So that's not what we've done. Only those aspects which undermine the community's own ability to run the institution, which are statutorily provided for, are sought to be attacked. So for instance, the first question that every Hindu who's bothered to read or taken interest in this subject has asked, what happens when the government chooses to vacate its royal back from this particular institution? What do we do? So is there a way that we run this institution? I said, please bother to read the legislation. There is a provision for a trust already. Those provisions are not being interfered with. The provisions that are being interfered with are the provisions which permit the Babus and the government statutorily to undermine another part of the legislation itself. So one part of the legislation is used to the detriment of another part of the legislation, thereby taking away the fundamental provision of autonomy of the community over its own institutions. So those overarching Orwellian big brotherly provisions are the provisions that are sought to be gone after. So if you can take that away, you still have a decent framework to go ahead with within the existing legislations, which do justice to two aspects. One, control. Two, stakeholdership. Three, use of funds. Four, let's say, retention, preservation, and maintenance of traditions. And five, architecture. These are the issues you're looking at. Architecture, gold, jewelry, contributions, and how do you manage this society, so to speak, and how do you make sure they're part of the running of this institution. All our social justice tendencies can be accommodated there. So the point is, attack the provision in part, leave the rest intact, and if you can tweak it a bit, there are workable solutions possible without us having to wait for one red revolution.
Fantastic. Before I throw to the thing, just 20 seconds. I completely second your point, because I just remembered from Sanjeev Sanyal's wonderful book, Churn. He actually said what you said initially, that initially, ancient times, or even in medieval, temples were actually governments. There were no governments as such, there were kings and queens, but the temples were the center of our lives. They provided schooling, they provided education, health, prosperity, banks. They were, and he said that the reason they were mostly on the banks of seas and rivers was because they there was easy, yes, absolutely. And they were replicated tens of thousands of times, and each one of them was successful. So maybe when, we talk of the government leaving complete control of temples, they can at least begin. They can charge administrative fee for the money that temple earns, but on the loss-making activities of them controlling temple land, at least they can relinquish that right, so that the temples can earn lakhs of crores versus lakhs that they are earning.
So here's an incentive that I'm willing to give the government. Charge the same amount, but to ensure that the money is used by Hindus and for Hindus. Do that. Which means the common good fund, if it is used for a secular activity which has got no benefit directly to the Hindu community, should result in us accusing the government of having breached its own, let's say, supervisionary.
That might also result in a lot of ghar vapsi. A lot of people would want to become
exactly
Hindus.
The point and exactly the direction in which I'm pushing it for.
Okay.
That you associate the church with education and hospital, I want to replace that in the Hindu mind, period.
Very interesting. Yes. Can we now throw open, there are a lot of hands that have gone up.
Please make your questions to the point and not longer than 30 seconds.
And focused on Bharat, because that is what the thing is.
Yeah, wait for the mic, please, and 30 seconds for one question, not more than that.
Okay. Do these restrictions on temples apply to the Arya Samaj and Ramakrishna Mission, for instance? And if not, how do they get around it? And how do they prosper?
So the first thing that I think we need to be able to frame the question slightly better, you don't have one, so sorry, I'll just wait for sir to, yeah? There is no umbrella legislation. So none of these questions should be general in nature, because you see, you have state-specific legislations in different parts of the country. So whether or not Ramakrishna Mission or its associated institutions are treated as HRC institutions, one, they're of course Hindu, notwithstanding the litigation that happened. Now, two, most of these states which don't have a specific HRC legislation use the Trusts Act, but in a selective fashion, a slightly selective fashion, okay? Because you see, if it happens to be a Waqf, then it goes out of the trust and goes to the Waqf legislation. And everybody else is governed by the Trust Act. So as far as Tamil Nadu is concerned, if you happen to be a matha or a temple associated with a matha, you are significantly immune from interference, okay? Which is why there is an attempt in the mid-70s to try and find out if there is a way that some of these important temples can be pushed under the umbrella of a particular matha, so to speak. But otherwise, some of these exceptions are available in certain states. Some states don't make this distinction between a mutt-run temple and a non-mutt-run temple. This distinction does not exist. It's a question of a state-specific legislation to see what does the provision of that particular legislation say. So to the best of my memory at this point, I don't think Bengal strikes this distinction. Yes?
Namaskaram. Actually, I had a question regarding...
Just a minute. Since it's an all-India institution, every institution or every branch will be subject to the laws of that particular state. So it's not as if there is a blanket exemption or a blanket treatment to Ramakrishna Mission. For that matter, even Arya Samaj for that matter. Now, Arya Samaj, I think, under the definition of Hindu, there is no exception. There is no exception to Arya Samaji temples as well. Jains are exempted, for that matter, from Tamil Nadu legislation, but Arya Samajis are not. Yes, that's the position. Yes.
Yeah. So my question was, like yesterday, Dr. Ranganathan
Only request. I tried to say this at the outset when somebody said, this is not a temple freedom session.
Yeah.
I have chosen to answer only very limited questions on this particular subject. I've said whatever I've wanted to, whatever little I know. I've said this in multiple platforms. So I would request you to do your research by watching that. Stick to the theme as much as possible. Yes.
Yeah. It's not a temple-related question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yesterday, Dr. Ranganathan was talking about Karl Popper and the paradox of intolerance.
Sorry, what?
Paradox of intolerance.
Right.
And Abhijit Ayar Mitra was talking about judicial reforms. Even today, you guys were talking about judicial reforms and other sorts of reforms. 295A is what something he was talking about yesterday. So my question is, all these things are indicative of some sort of Republic 2.0. So what do you think, like, if that will happen, when that will happen, and how that will happen? Is it something like a Subhash Bose INA thing or a Bolshevik revolution or stuff like that? Thank you.
In the 1920s, after Lala Lajpat Rai was deported and once he came back, this was after his participation in the land agitation in Punjab, which was known as the Pagdi Sambhal Jatta movement, which he fought along with Bhagat Singh's father and uncle Kishan Singh and Ajit Singh. He realized that the invention and the creation of the Congress had dulled Bharat's revolutionary instincts significantly, because that organization was found as an anger management and containment organization. This I've elaborated significantly in the second book. This is a shameless pitch for the second book. So I've dealt with significantly. Now I think that he also lamented that this was the reason why the revolutionaries weren't getting support from either the money bags or the masses. Now that is effectively the DNA of the current society still. It hasn't changed significantly, no matter how much we say, Kshatra badhao, ye badhao, that hasn't happened yet. Okay? So the first level of response is, I don't think India is capable of a revolution in the manner in which you understand it typically, or those connotations don't apply to the current society at this stage. That's one. Second, as far as, let's say, a Bharat 2.0, a Dharmic Republic, or whatever it is, first, whenever I refer to Bharat as a Dharmic Republic, it's neither a theological state nor is it a theocratic state, because Dharma is not theology in the way you understand it, so that distinction needs to be understood first. Second, I think that the research on that particular front in that department is woefully short for anybody to come out with a very specific flesh and bone response as to how it would look like, or how would it touch, smell, taste, and all that. You have no idea. So right now, I think there are initiatives being undertaken by multiple people at different angles. Culturally, how would it look? Constitutionally, how would it look? From an academic perspective, how would it look? There is no attempt on the part of the one entity which is supposed to bring all of these people together to see, okay, what should be the master template, and that entity has to be the state. So far, I don't think the entity has actually taken that interest to understand, can we actually hit a reset? That question hasn't been asked. So perhaps when, let's say, you have enough research and enough material in the public domain, and you start generating a chorus of voices around this particular subject through articles, through discussions, and people start saying, now I think it's time for us to go for a 2.0, because the first, let's say, the first phase of this experiment has failed miserably, has failed the Hindus miserably, then I think there is a pressure which hopefully would translate to political pressure and then translates to an electoral incentive, which then you're looking at the delivery of goods at some point. But you're not going to be able to do this in less than 2 decades. I don't think it's going to happen in less than 2 decades. So I would, assuming that we are witnessing Khilafat 2.0, and we are in the midst of Khilafat 2.0, let's see, I would say that it would take about 25 years from the end of that particular Khilafat. And our reactions to what's going on and our decisions that we take as a society, which would decide the way forward. So far, I don't think we have taken a decision yet. Reactions are not decisions. We are reacting to it. We haven't taken a decision yet.
Okay, we've run out of time. We'll just take maybe a couple of questions.
Namaste, Sai Deepak. I just had a simple question on the trade-off between economy. Sure. I was particularly interested when you said that as you grow as an economy, you become richer and therefore you're less likely to be coerced into conversions and things like that.
South Korea is an exception, I understand.
Right, that's fair.
Yes.
I think like world over, we've seen that as countries get richer, they then, tend to become less and less, religious and so on. That's why missionaries and so on move to poorer countries. How do you think India will resist this problem, particularly when there's so much like, let's say, Hindu hate and things like that within liberal circles? Thank you.
As long as we continue to see Europe as the model to emulate from an economics perspective, whether you like it or not, you would also be emulating Europe from a cultural perspective. No wonder you believe that for us to be economically prosperous, you need the European model of secularism to be imported here. But you don't even understand that for you to import it properly here, because if you understood it, you wouldn't value an Indian brand of secularism, right? So the only way that I think you can strike a balance between both is that perhaps you go with a hybrid model of economics to see what is it that you can learn from the other side, and also what is it that you can do to retain your own contributions to economic thinking, and also retain, at the very least, the current levels of cultural awareness in the hope that it continues, which means reject those parts of Western economic thinking which require you to undergo through another round of secularization, which I think would be unacceptable, because then what are you ultimately fighting for? If this is what you want, you might as well offer yourself en masse as a population for conversion. You might as well benefit economically. That's what they are anyway offering you. Let us all be one huge rise-back population. That will be the end of it.
Hi, here.
Yeah, but if I can just add to that very quickly, I think when you very correctly put that the welfareism aspect needs to be shifted away from state to, very rightly, to religions that others are doing it, other religions are doing it, Hindus are being shackled from doing it. I think what possibly we can also comment on is the sheer magnitude or the difference in scale of what the government welfareism is possible and what the temples are possible. So the example is front of us in the last 2 years during COVID. I mean, it is physically impossible for, let's say, a temple that is even controlling, let's say, some and successful temple or a bunch of those temples to feed 80 crore people, to vaccinate twice over 1 billion people. So that money will always be a repository of the government. Right. So we would always be struggling, and we must always be forcing the government to use that money wisely and to generate that money wisely. Of course, what you say is correct, and I'm not against that at all.
Right.
But the sheer scale is scary.
Understood. I'll just add one point to what Anand has said, and hopefully I'll shut up with that. The point is, I think, if you were to even revisit our notions of a Bharatiya state and how it is supposed to look and all that, I would assume that going by how we have chosen to treat society as permanent and state as transient, the attempt has been that the fall of a particular regime shouldn't translate to an upheaval in the society's existence, and that's how our institutions have been structured. That was significantly retained, even according to me, during the Islamic invasions. For the very first time, the entire system was broken and infiltrated inside out after the advent of the European colonizer. Until then, I think that system was still working, which is very clear from the continuity of education systems until his advent, which is very clear from the continuity of other societal institutions, good, bad, and ugly, until his advent.
To give you a light-hearted analogy, BJP is temporary, RSS is forever.
I am not getting into that. To quote Mr. Vajpayee, मैं इसमें पढ़ना नहीं चाहता. Okay. So the point I am trying to make is perhaps the ideal dharmic state would be a state which creates conditions which are conducive for continuity of societal institutions and has a soft touch approach, as opposed to being entrenched in the society deeply, which we don't want, either from an education perspective or a religious perspective. Protect us from the outside and give us the atmospherics needed to thrive. I think the Hindu society is capable of doing the rest.
You want more philanthropy from our billionaires? Would that be added to this, or?
I'll answer that question the day I become one.
here. I think mine would be the last one. Um, I'll just keep it as short as possible. Will Bharat, that is when I'm referring Bharat, Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, will they be able to sustain the heritage, culture, and religion with the onslaught of commercializations? I mean, when I say commercialization in terms of businesses, if people have to stay there, they need to earn money. And if commerce activities happen over there, IT hubs go over there, then will they be able to sustain religion, culture, and heritage?
Perhaps you may want to keep industries which thrive on urbanization outside these cities and keep them to the tier 1 cities. And those business models which keep their ways of life alive, maybe you can focus on that. Two, I think one example, and perhaps this is one city that I would like to watch and see the decision it takes to protect itself as a cultural hub of a particular state, is Mysore. Okay. Because it's undergoing massive amounts of, let's say, movement from Bangalore to Mysore. And I think with that, the infection spreads further from Bangalore to Mysore. Okay. And there is an active civil society movement to resist that particular transition, because it comes with huge, let's say, burden on the infrastructure is the first thing. Second, all the traditional style architecture, which we all go gaga over once we go to San Francisco, we lose that in Mysore. Okay. Three, along with that, changes the cultural facade of that particular society and its attitude to culture. So they're trying to resist that as much as possible under a supposedly Hindu government. Okay. So the development activity that's being undertaken in Chamundi Hills has been actively resisted, including by Sri Bhairappa. He's written articles and he's initiated letter campaigns against that. He's even written to perhaps the topmost constitutional authority in this country to no effect and to no avail. I would like to see what they do next and see if you can protect Mysore, then perhaps you know what would be the way forward as far as the other cities are concerned. Because if Mysore as the cultural capital of Karnataka is not able to protect itself, then the hope may not be as much for other tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So let's see, wait and watch.